Alright guys, so today I'm going to briefly introduce you to the topic of sectionalism, which will be the topic for this entire unit that we're going to cover right before the Civil War. And then to go a little bit more in depth with sectionalism, we're going to talk about really the first event that starts this sectionalism within the United States, and that event is called the Missouri Compromise. It's something that we've talked about already, but I just wanted to once again reemphasize the Missouri Compromise, tell you about the different parts of it, talk about the differences between the North and the South, just to, like I said, once again emphasize the importance of this particular event as it leads into the American Civil War, the splitting of the country, and the eventual secession of the South. So, as we get into that, before we talk about the Missouri Compromise, we need to talk about what leads up into it and what's going on within the United States. And like I said, a lot of this, if not all of this, will actually be somewhat of a review. But anyway, to just kind of elaborate on the different regions within the United States, we already know the big sections within the U.S. are the North up here, the South, and then the West, which we really won't get into too terribly much because the West is not super developed at this point in time. It's kind of doing its own thing. It mostly aligns with the North in terms of its political leanings, but really we're going to put most of our emphasis and really look at the North and the South and its differences. So to reiterate, the North, it is mostly based upon manufacturing, the creation of these factories that create a finished textile product. As you can see at this map, which you've seen before, there's a much larger concentration of factories up in the North, the red ones being the textile factories that use southern cotton to make a finished textile product, and then the black ones being just different factories that make different things. A variety of different goods that are then shipped out throughout the rest of the United States or across the seas to Europe. But one thing to emphasize here is from 1800 to 1860, the North and the South, they're very, very different in terms of their economies, their cultures, their populations. Just two completely different regions with the North, mostly focusing on that manufacturing. And then we look down here at the South. And so when we look at the South, we can see that with these purple dots here, they represent 2,000 slaves. Each individual dot does. And so you have a huge concentration of slaves, especially in the deeper portions of the South. And we know already that the reason that there's such this huge concentration down here is because they are growing southern cotton down there. They have a huge need and a huge desire for slave labor in the deeper part of the South because of the growing of cotton. And then as you move further and further up and the climate starts to change in the United States, you can see that slavery really starts to taper off. And then once you get past Maryland, the last of the southern states, the northernmost southern state really, you see that there really are no more slaves in the U.S., especially up in this northern region. You don't see any real purple dots here. And so that is just one thing I really want to emphasize is that the climate itself doesn't suit slavery. Northerners aren't going to use slaves in factories because they need somewhat skilled workers, people that can actually go in a factory and be responsible for the work that they're doing, be attentive, skilled laborers to a certain degree, and they just won't use slaves for that labor. They'll use immigrants or they'll use women, they'll use a different type of labor as opposed to the South, which doesn't need that. They don't want immigrants because they have to pay them a wage. They don't want to have to pay people to work out here. So instead, they will purchase slaves to farm all of that cotton, to pick all of that cotton and make sure it's processed. So, like I said, once again, review here, but just to re-emphasize the difference between these two regions. So, King Cotton, that is that southernmost region of the United States where cotton is being grown, is going to really transform the South into that big, big cash crop based economy. That's really all the South is going to be doing. So because the South is going to be mostly rural and mostly growing cotton, you're going to see the South develop differently than the North will. The South is really going to lack manufacturing. They aren't going to be building very many factories in the South. They're going to also have very few railroads as well because the South, and its rural economy is really based around rivers or the coast. And you can see at this map right here, most of the railroads are concentrated in the north. It's much more densely concentrated. There are so many more railroads going on and being built up here as opposed to the south, where railroads are really, really sparse and kind of hard to come by. And that's because like areas like South Carolina, areas like Louisiana, and all this down here, these are all right by the coast or right by rivers. So all of that cotton that is being shipped out of the south can be transported via those natural waterways. This graph here just emphasizing the increase in cotton production as we move closer and closer to the Civil War. And that's just to kind of show you how important cotton production is by 1860, how much cotton is really coming out of the South, and why it is that the South is putting up such a huge fight all the way up to 1860 and through the Civil War. Their entire economy is based on cotton, which means their entire economy is based upon slavery. So without slavery, without slaves being used as labor in the South, really the South has no economy anymore. They need that labor. They require that labor. So without it, they will have no economy. The South will fall to pieces, and Southerners just can't imagine a life and maintaining the lifestyle that they have without Southern cotton and Southern slavery. So, one more time, just to emphasize the growth of slavery, we know that slavery is going to increase significantly from the 1800s to 1860 because of the invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney. Slavery is actually on the decline as 1800 rolls around. This map shows you kind of the spread of slavery in 1820, and then the second map here shows you slavery and as it spreads up to 1860. So 40 years later, and you see a massive increase of slaves. It gets more densely populated in areas like Virginia, areas like South Carolina, where you have mostly tobacco being grown up here, but this is where cotton is really being grown down here in like South Carolina, and then also here in the deeper portions of the South as well. But one thing I want you to make sure to notice is not only is slavery getting more dense in these eastern portions of the United States in the South, but also slavery is starting to move westward as well. You look at this map, and there's not very many slaves there in the West, but as you look at this one, slavery is starting to move further and further westward. And so the issue that comes up is once the populations hit that critical mass where a state is admitted into the Union, well, what kind of state should these new Western states be? Should they be free or should they be slave? And why does that become an issue? When does that first become a problem? Well, it starts with this state of Missouri, which you can see has a really, really dense slave population for a westward state. I'm going to skip that. So before I explain the Missouri Compromise for you, I just want to emphasize and let you know what sectionalism is. The broadest definition of it is the placing of interests of a region, a particular part of the United States, above the interests of the United States or the nation as a whole. So Southerners don't necessarily care or think it is as important to care about the entirety of the United States. Southerners care about the South. That is what they are most interested in, the benefit of the South, what will help the South, what will help Southerners, what will help their economy and their culture, what makes them flourish. And it's the same with the North. The North doesn't necessarily care what's going on with the rest of the United States or what would benefit it. They care more about what will benefit the North, what is best for the North, and so on. And it's because of this people get very northern-minded and southern-minded. So you see a splitting within the United States because of these mindsets, and that leads to this sectionalism that is going to cause the country to eventually split. Because instead of thinking of the well-being of the country as a whole, instead people are only thinking about the particular region that they are living in, whether that be the North or the South. Just to explain sectionalism and its importance from about 1820 to 1850, sectionalism is a problem, but it's a fixable problem. It's one that keeps coming up and keeps coming up, this issue of slavery, how to fix it, what to do about it, but it is one that can be resolved through compromise. All the way up to 1850, there is always a solution to these sectional problems. How do we keep the U.S. unified? Well, here's another compromise. Okay, we've got another issue. Well, here's another compromise. So this is a mild period of sectionalism. The United States isn't on the precipice of splitting at this point. Everything can be fixed. These problems can be solved. And then once we get to 1850, those things start to change. But the time that we're going to talk about specifically is in 1820. So how does everything start? Well, the first major issue starts in the early antebellum era in 1820 when Missouri wants to become a state. And so Northerners and Southerners want to make sure to maintain that equal balance between free and slave states, specifically in the Senate. That is one of the houses of Congress. So let me explain briefly how this would work, and then also how Missouri coming into the mix would mess things up and mess up that balance. So let's say we have a free state, and for this example, I'll just say New York. New York, one free state. And then we'll have a slave state, South Carolina. And we know that each state gets 2 senators. So here in this example, we have one free state and one slave state. So that means 2 free senators and 2 slave senators. So if these 2 senators and these 2 senators in this 2v2 conflict, if these 2 senators disagree with these other 2, that doesn't necessarily matter because it would be a 2v2 split. So they'll have to work together. They'll have to compromise. No one has the most power. It is equal. There is an equal split. So this is what's going on in the U.S. right now. There's an equal split in the Senate. There aren't more free states, there aren't more slave states. It is equal. So what happens is Missouri wants to become a state. They want to be introduced into the Union because they've hit that critical mass of population. They want to become a state. They want representation. Well, the issue that comes up is, well, okay, if Missouri becomes a slave state, then what's going to happen is they're going to get their 2 senators as well, which means there's going to be more slave senators or slave state senators, which then makes an imbalance. So now there is an imbalance in the Senate, and slave states have more power because now there's only 2 free senators and there's 4 slave senators. So any sort of legislation, any sort of decisions that are made in the Senate, you're going to have an imbalance, and slave states are going to win every single time because they can overrule the free states simply because they just have more senators that are going to agree with a Southern way of life, a Southern way of thinking, a slave-based way of thinking, even though these free senators don't agree with that. So, the Northern and Southern opinions on slavery, there's really 2 big ones. The abolitionist movement isn't huge yet, so it's not really an abolitionist mindset in the North. The big Northern idea of slavery is that it's fine where it's at. Like, keep it in the South, we're absolutely cool with that. However, we don't want it to continue to spread off into these Western territories. We don't want that to happen. Keep slavery where it is, keep it contained, but don't let it go anywhere else. And the reason for that is because you have a lot of immigrants, you have a lot of Northerners that are moving out west, specifically to farm. And so when they move out there, there's no way that they could compete with Southern slavery. There's no way that they could do that. And so Northerners want to protect these Western farmers from slavery and the competition that it would bring by limiting where slavery can expand to. So they say, keep slavery in the South, that's fine. Don't let it come into the West because these Western farmers cannot compete with Southern slavery. Southerners, on the other hand, they want slavery to spread as far across the United States as it can. They don't think that Congress has the power. They don't think Congress has the authority to stop slavery and its spread. They use the justification that if slaves are property, you have a right to property. You have a right to that. It is protected by the United States Constitution. Therefore, Congress can't deny people their right to property. And if you say you can't have your slave in this territory, well, that's my right to property. The slave is my property. You're violating my rights. And that is the Southern argument. So Northerners and Southerners not seeing eye to eye on this particular issue. So, how was the issue of balancing the Senate fixed? It's actually a really, really quick fix that Henry Clay ends up negotiating, and it's called the Missouri Compromise. So he introduces Missouri as a slave state. Missouri having that big slave population, it's obvious that it'll be a slave state, but he needs to maintain that balance in the Senate. So what he does is he said, okay, we'll have Missouri become a slave state, and we'll introduce another new state, and that'll be Maine. And so Maine is going to break away from Massachusetts, and Maine will be admitted as a free state. That way the balance in the Senate is maintained. And so after that, there's one more part of it, and that is that slavery will be outlawed in all westward territories above this particular line, the 3630 line. And one thing I need you to know about this line is it is a temporary solution. It is temporary. Okay, so there's that. We're all done.